When Jadeveon Clowney entered the league in 2014, it seemed like we were possibly going to be watching the next ultra dominant, ultra whatever you want to say about him in terms of his athleticism. We were possibly seeing the next great dominant defensive end, period. After laying an absolutely ruthless hit against the Michigan Wolverines in the 2012 Outback Bowl, it seemed like the hype train for Jadeveon Clowney just kept on rolling and rolling until he was selected number 1 overall by the Texans in 2014. Clowney would go on to declare for the NFL draft after his junior year and would follow up his highlight-worthy college career. He followed that up with an absolutely otherworldly combine performance in 2014. Jadeveon Clowney's combine performance can basically be summed up as Mike Evans' combine performance, just Jadeveon Clowney weighed about 40 pounds heavier at the combine. Both players ran a 4.53 40, and both jumped about 37 inches in the vertical jump. However, the difference is Mike Evans is a bona fide skill receiver who has been to multiple Pro Bowls and possibly could be in the running for a top 5 receiver spot. And Jadeveon Clowney is a defensive end whose his only true purpose on the football field is to get after the quarterback and make the occasional run stop. But anyways, getting back to Jadeveon Clowney, after that performance at the Combine and after his illustrious college career, he went into the NFL, drafted by the Texans number 1 overall, with the hype for him never being bigger. And while it's easy to say that he probably didn't live up to the hype, at this point in his career, it shouldn't be said that he's a bust either. It is also easy to criticize Jadeveon Clowney's performance so far in the NFL because of who was drafted after him. People have to remember this was the draft that we saw Aaron Donald, Khalil Mack, DeMarcus Lawrence, Dee Ford, and Jadeveon Clowney come in the first 34 picks. So looking back, obviously hindsight is 20/20, but I think if you were to say, if you were to give the Texans a redo, they probably would still draft Jadeveon Clowney. Just because of the potential that he had, nobody was seeing Aaron Donald as a double-digit sack performer coming out of college. No one saw Khalil Mack having the career that he's had so far. I mean, Khalil Mack had questions because he came from Buffalo. So he had his questions there. DeMarcus Lawrence came from a decent football school at Boise State, but he never really just absolutely outperformed everyone he played, and I don't really even remember hearing about Dee Ford coming out of college. Just looking back at this draft alone, I think it would be really hard for anyone to say that we would see this much talent, or the prospects that came from this draft would be as talented as they were. Obviously, I talked about Jadeveon Clowney and other pass rushers, but this draft produced a lot of skill position guys and guys on the defensive side as well. We saw names like Mike Evans and Eric Ebron come from this draft, offensive line talents like Taylor Lewan and Zach Martin, and there were plenty of linebackers in this draft like Anthony Barr, Ryan Shazier, and CJ Mosley, who also went in the first round. So all around, this draft pretty much had everything except for a solid quarterback. The main quarterbacks going into this draft were Blake Bortles, Johnny Manziel, and I believe there was a third one. I can't exactly remember him right. Oh, Teddy Bridgewater. Teddy Bridgewater was the third quarterback who was kind of being thrown around as top talents at the quarterback position in this draft. And none of them really panned out. The best quarterback that came from this draft was Derek Carr. And he's had a solid career, but nothing that's really turned the tables in the Raiders' favor. So like I said, obviously hindsight is 20/20, but I think even if the Texans knew what they know now, that Jadeveon Clowney has this go around, he didn't have the career that he had the hype for, I think they would still pick him because there were a lot of things that went wrong in Houston that had nothing to do with Jadeveon Clowney. Jadeveon Clowney didn't have anything to do with J.J. Watt and Whitney Mercilus getting injured in the same season. Jadeveon Clowney didn't have any say over Bill O'Brien being the head coach. We obviously have seen his problems. Jadeveon Clowney didn't have anything to do with Deshaun Watson tearing his ACL in his rookie season. And Jadeveon Clowney didn't make the boneheaded free agent and draft decisions that the Texans made. Jadeveon Clowney was just a product of his environment in terms of being in the Houston situation where he pretty much played up to his potential. I would say he played up to his potential in terms of producing, in terms of being a highly effective player. And it seemed like a lot of people in the organization still tried to find ways to blame him. Obviously, as a fan of the Texans, I would have loved to see Jadeveon Clowney been able to produce even more. But it's hard for a guy like that to be in a position where he was and produce even more than he was. The guy went to 3 straight Pro Bowls, and people were still trying to knock him on his performance. For some reason, there has been a thing going around in Jadeveon Clowney's career, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but there's been a thing surrounding Jadeveon Clowney throughout his NFL career, at least, that he likes to take plays off, or he doesn't give a full effort on every play. And while maybe that's true, I just haven't seen it yet. There also has been the problem throughout his NFL career where he's been a little bit injury prone, and again, he can't really change that. He's just kind of, all he can do is play the game. If he gets injured, then he gets injured. He doesn't really have a say in that. However, it is still somewhat, it still leaves a little bit more to be desired, even though I still believe that he pretty much did all that he could. The problems that surrounded Jadeveon Clowney in Houston followed him to Seattle when he was traded. Both criticisms of him being injury prone and the criticisms of him having somewhat of a lackluster motor in terms of giving his all on every single down. But again, Jadeveon Clowney, when put in his position, I don't really see how he could have done more. Obviously, you would have liked to see the guy get more than 3 sacks last year. But look at who he was playing with. I mean, Seattle's defense has been going through a rebuilding stage for the past about 2 or 3 seasons. I mean, they've lost names like Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor and Richard Sherman, and names that were mainstays in that locker room have just been cast away in the past 2 to 3 seasons. They've either left or they've retired. So putting him in that situation where he pretty much had to be the superstar, he had Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright last year, but I mean, they're not exactly helping him in the pass rush game. Throw in the fact that apparently Ezekiel Ansah was supposed to be his co-star along the defensive line, and he also had his issues both with injuries and just lackluster performance, and it was not a recipe that equaled success for the Seahawks or Jadeveon Clowney last season. Now we've been in the offseason for about 3 or 4 months, and Jadeveon Clowney is still a free agent. He probably was a top 10 player going into free agency this year, and he's still available like a month to 2 months after all the big names have signed. And there's been a few teams that have been thrown out, teams like the Browns or the Titans, or even possibly going back to the Seahawks, that have either had their contract negotiations with Jadeveon Clowney leaked to the public, or they have been linked as somewhat interesting teams that have been interested in Jadeveon Clowney. But there has been one team that I haven't exactly heard about showing interest in Jadeveon Clowney, and maybe they have, it just hasn't been made to the public yet. But the one team that I would really love for Jadeveon Clowney to go to is the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos last season they somewhat had a season that was similar to Jadeveon Clowney's. They had somewhat of high expectations going into last year. They thought they had pieces in place to make somewhat of a run, but certain things happened that they couldn't control. They could have controlled replacing Joe Flacco with Drew Lock earlier in the season. Not exactly, because Drew Lock got injured, but they could have not traded for Joe Flacco. I don't really know how to phrase that situation. That was just a bad situation with Joe Flacco in the first place. But for some reason, Broncos fans see their seasons always possibly ending in a Super Bowl, and that's probably why expectations were too high for them last season, and they just couldn't live up to it. There were other problems circulating around the league or around the team, like injuries. They had Bradley Chubb go down for most of the season. Von Miller, he wasn't injured, but he just kind of was. He didn't have the typical Von Miller season that we normally see from him. For his first season since he entered the league, he did not force a single fumble, and he had his lowest sack total since, I believe, his 3rd year in the league. And that 3rd year in the league, when he had 5 sacks, he only played in 9 games. So even then, it's kind of hard to compare a game where he played 15 games, or a season where he played 15 games to a season where he played only 9. But this deep into free agency, I believe that the Denver Broncos are in a position to really put a cherry on top to what they've done in this free agency. They've quietly had a very good offseason. They brought in AJ Bouye from the Jaguars, who seem to be casting away every single player that they can. They brought in Jarrell Casey from the Titans, who has been longly an underrated defensive end slash defensive tackle hybrid in Tennessee. He's always been a solid contributor along that defensive line, and now that he's in Denver, he's probably going to be the guy that's replacing Derek Wolfe as the do-it-all guy along the defensive line. And obviously, you know the two names that are in that pass rushing room for the Broncos with Von Miller and Bradley Chubb. Once those guys are fully healthy and playing up to their capabilities, those two are pretty much impossible to stop along that pass rush. So adding Jadeveon Clowney to that pass rush, it both just adds an uber talented guy to the team, but it also gives them a backup plan for Von Miller or Bradley Chubb, or possibly both. We don't exactly know what Bradley Chubb is going to be when he comes back from his injury, and even if he's somewhat up to where he was playing in his rookie season, it probably is going to take the first month or two of the season for him to get fully healthy and fully back up to game speed. And like I said, Von Miller probably last year was his worst season he's had for a while. It still was a solid season. He ended up going to the Pro Bowl, but again, it wasn't a typical Von Miller season that we're used to seeing from him. But the situation gets even scarier if you think about Von Miller and Bradley Chubb coming back fully healthy at the start of the season and both fully playing up to their capabilities. You throw in Jadeveon Clowney to that mix. You throw in Jarrell Casey. You throw in an underrated name in Shelby Harris. You throw in a couple of underrated linebackers like A.J. Johnson and Todd Davis. That defensive front is stacked. And now when you've got the back end, you've got an all-pro caliber safety in Justin Simmons. You've got a solid contributing safety with Kareem Jackson, who kind of plays a safety slash cornerback hybrid. And you've got a shutdown corner in AJ Bouye. And you've got a couple solid names like Duke Dawson. And I believe there's one more name, Isaac Yiadom, I think his name is. I'm not exactly sure how to say his name. But again, if they're able to contribute well in their system, that's just going to make their team even more elite. Looking at this team, if they were to add Jadeveon Clowney, you would be adding his name to an already stacked group of pass rushers. You got names like Shelby Harris and Von Miller and Bradley Chubb and Jarrell Casey. Adding Jadeveon Clowney makes that fifth guy in the room where it's not exactly the same type of players, but it reminds me a little bit of the players that were in Philly when they won their Super Bowl. You look at that Philadelphia Eagles roster when they won the Super Bowl, you've got names like Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox and Chris Long and Derek Barnett, Timmy Jernigan and Vinnie Curry. You've got a lot of guys who were great at what they did for a few plays in the game that were monumental plays during the game. They were either stopping the run, they were either getting after the quarterback, or just all in all giving and getting pressure to the offensive line and the skill position players. Not to mention, a pass rush that is that elite only can help your defensive secondary, because any great corner, any great safety will tell you that they're not able to make the production that they're able to make if they don't have a pass rush in front of them that can hurry the quarterback or disrupt him in general. I mean, that's kind of what covered up the Philadelphia Eagles secondary. That kind of blanketed their flaw during that Super Bowl run. I mean, Malcolm Jenkins was still a Pro Bowl cornerback at that time, but they still had guys who were pretty much liabilities in pass coverage, like Ronald Darby, Jalen Mills, and other guys like that who they weren't great, but they had things go their way where the pass rush helped them, and they were put in positions to succeed, where they really had no chance but to succeed in certain situations. But again, it's even scarier to think about because this Broncos secondary isn't the Philadelphia Eagles secondary. I'd say at this point, Justin Simmons is probably better than where Malcolm Jenkins was at his career and at this point in his life, because Justin Simmons is about 6 or 7 years younger, and he's already putting up all-pro caliber numbers. AJ Bouye is a bona fide number one lockdown corner. And Kareem Jackson is still a solid contributing piece along that defensive secondary. They're just really another corner away from being one of the better defenses we've seen in a long time. I truly believe that. This also can only help a offense in Denver that was pretty much lackluster up until Drew Lock took over, and I don't really agree with the strategy that the Broncos used for Drew Lock. I know they didn't really have a choice to play him early in the season due to his wrist injury, but I feel like they still put him on the field too quickly because I feel like it's hard for a rookie to play 5 games at the end of a season. Pretty much a meaningless 5 games because at this point the Broncos were all but eliminated from playoff contention. And they pretty much were playing for stats and pride at this point last season. But Drew Lock, even though he kind of set the league on fire with his play, he didn't really have a chance to get his rookie mistakes out. He still made the occasional mistake here and there, but he didn't go through a full season of making his mistakes and learning from them like many other quarterbacks did who were drafted in the higher rounds and were thrown into the fire immediately. I think about guys like Russell Wilson or Andrew Luck or Robert Griffin. Robert Griffin's not exactly a great example, but I'm more talking about guys like Andrew Luck and Russell Wilson. They were put into the starting position early in their career. They made their mistakes early, and they had a great defense behind them who could pick up the slack and still get them to playoff contention, but be able to play with this rookie quarterback and know he's going to get these mistakes out now and be an even more fine-tuned quarterback in the next season. I'm not exactly sure if Drew Lock has those mistakes out yet because he just doesn't have the same experience that those guys had. Still, having a defense that would be this good, adding Jadeveon Clowney to it, it will help Drew Lock in that offense immensely because now they don't have to be as aggressive. The Denver Broncos defense last year was ranked towards the bottom in terms of turnovers, and that hurts the offense because they're not getting easy opportunities starting in the opponent's, inside the opponent's 35-yard line, which is almost a guaranteed 3 points for the team. Almost even a guaranteed 7 points when you start talking about guys, getting interceptions in the opponent's red zone or getting, forcing fumbles on the quarterback with strip sacks. It helps out a second-year quarterback, and it helps out an offense that's really trying to find their way and find their groove. Last year, they had 2 guys who pretty much carried the load for them offensively with Phillip Lindsay and Courtland Sutton both going over 1,000 yards in their respective categories. But there wasn't another guy who kind of contributed. Noah Fant had his occasional game, but it was like one in every 2 months he had a great game. He had, I believe, 1 game over 100 yards, and he had 12 or 13 where he had less than 40, something like that. So being how high they drafted him, he probably was a bust last year. But again, he would be helped by a defense that good supporting him and backing him even though they might make mistakes. Whatever ends up happening if Jadeveon Clowney goes to Denver, I feel like it's almost a guaranteed successful plan because just looking at the talent around Clowney, if he were to go to Denver, he wouldn't have to be the main superstar like he had to be in Houston and like he had to be in Seattle. That will just take all the pressure off of him, and it will take a lot of spotlight off of him in terms of, blocking assignments from the offensive line or whatever ends up happening. He won't be double-teamed on over half the game, and he'll have a chance to really shine and show why he was the number 1 overall pick in 2014. And again, this isn't really a prediction of where Jadeveon Clowney will go. This is more of just a what-if kind of thing. Hypothetically, if Jadeveon Clowney were to go to Denver, how would that affect the team? How would it affect the defense? How would it affect the offense? I think in both cases it would help tremendously just because of the talent that Jadeveon Clowney brings. And not only the talent, he's had a somewhat proven track record. He's not the most successful pass rusher from his draft, but he still has a high ceiling. I mean, the guy's only 27, I believe, so he has a long way to go before he's really at the end of his career. So without there being much more to say, I think that's going to be the end of the video for me. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, make sure you leave a like down below. If you did not like it, then make sure you hit the dislike button. Any feedback from you guys at this point is it's much needed and much appreciated. If you like what I put out, if you like the videos I put out, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell as well. If there's something you think that I forgot to talk about, make sure you leave a comment down below. I try to get to as many as possible. And yeah, that's going to be the video for me. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.